So let us see what the Holy Spirit has to say to us today to guide us. So one of the most fruitful ways of reading Scripture is to imagine myself as the person being referred to in a particular biblical narrative. So I am Adam, I am Abraham, I am King David, I am the prodigal son, I am the priest who didn't stop to help the man who had been beaten and left for dead by robbers in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I am Pontius Pilate, I am Judas, I am Peter denying Jesus 3 times. We can imagine ourselves as each one of these characters. So this morning I want you to imagine that you are Cain who killed his brother Abel. I want you to identify with Cain. So let us read the story together as it is narrated in the book of Genesis. So we read, Abel became a herder of flocks, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground, while Abel, for his part, brought the fatty portion of the firstlings of his flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. So Cain was very angry and dejected. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why are you dejected? If you act rightly, you will be accepted. But if not, sin lies in wait at the door. Its urge is for you. Yet you can rule over it." Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out in the field." When they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord asked Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He answered, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" God then said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are banned from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the ground, it shall no longer give you its produce. You shall become a constant wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Look, you have now banished me from the ground. I must avoid you and be a constant wanderer on the earth. Anyone may kill me at sight." "Not so," the Lord said to him. "If anyone kills Cain, Cain shall be avenged 7 times. So the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one would kill him at sight. Cain left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So that is the account we get in the book of Genesis. So let's look at the interaction between Cain and God. The first thing we can comment on is Cain's relationship with God. We are told he was angry because God preferred Abel's offering to his offering. So here there are 2 interesting attitudes on the part of Cain. First, he is angry with God's response to his offering. In other words, he was prepared to offer what he had grown to God, but he was expecting a more appreciative response from God. In his own mind, there was a sort of contract mentality. I give an offering to God, but I expect God to respond with gratitude. I can ask myself, is that how my relationship with God is? Yes, I am offering my life to God, but am I expecting something in return? What am I expecting? Success, praise, satisfaction, recognition, a comfortable life? Perhaps I'm expecting something in return. So part of Cain's anger stems from jealousy. He is angry because God showed more favor to his brother Abel than to him. Jealousy is a very human emotion. It can sometimes masquerade as outrage against injustice. Cain could think, it's not fair that God shows more favor towards Abel than towards me. This is the attitude of the workers in the parable, where the worker who only did 1 hour's work gets the same pay as those who work the whole day. The correct attitude is that Cain should be happy for his brother, that his offering was so pleasing to God. This happiness for his brother should fill his heart so much that there is no room for feeling disappointed that his offering was less pleasing to God. So if I fail at something and my brother succeeds, am I capable of rejoicing in my brother's success? Or am I focused on the fact that I have failed? Perhaps I am envious of my brother. Sometimes we don't like to see others succeed, particularly if we fail at the same thing. Okay, in exam results, someone gets a higher mark and someone gets a lower mark. On a game of football, one team wins and the other loses. Okay. We speak about the fact of being a good loser. A good loser is someone who's able to congratulate the person who won and say, yes, you deserve to win. A bad loser is someone who sulks in the corner and can't accept the fact that someone is better than me. Some people, either they win or nothing else has value. Okay? So the happiness for his brother should fill his heart so much that there is no room for feeling disappointed that his offering was less pleasing to God. But that is not Cain's mentality. Cain sees his brother as a rival. So that is one attitude that someone can have in life. Life is a competition, and everyone else is a rival. Either I win and the other loses, or else the other wins and I lose and I can't accept that. So the other then is a rival. The other is a threat to my success. We see this in the business world, right? Big business, some other small business starts, and it looks as if it's going to be very successful. So the big business cannot tolerate that. So what does it do? It goes and buys out the smaller business. It gobbles it up, right? Because it cannot have rivals in the business world. I must have a monopoly of everything. I can't allow anyone else to threaten my supremacy. Okay, it can happen in politics as well. A party in power can't accept the fact that another party is becoming popular, right? Cannot accept the fact that it may no longer be in power. So then we get the dictator who suppresses all other possible opposition. Okay? It's either me or no one else. Okay, so that's part of human nature, to see others as rivals. Life is a competition. So Cain sees his brother as a rival. In Cain's view, it is either him or me. Cain is the typical egoist, self-centered, thinking only of himself. Because of this, he knows nothing about love. He knows nothing about the logic of love, which is that I only become happy when I am focused on the happiness of my neighbor. That is the logic of love. I can only be happy when I'm focused on the happiness of my neighbor. Instead, for Cain, the happiness of Abel is a threat to his own happiness. So, love is benevolent towards the other. Bene volere, to literally means wanting the good of the other person. Love is benevolent. If I love someone, I want his good. So if Cain were to love his brother Abel, he would have been happy with the fact that God showed favor to his offering. He would have rejoiced in the happiness of his brother. But that is not what he did. Instead, hatred is malevolent, which literally means wanting evil for the person. Okay, a person who hates is malevolent. He wants something evil to happen to the person he hates. He's happy if the person fails an exam. He's happy if the person breaks their leg. He's happy if the person is sick. He's happy whenever something bad happens to, that is to hate. Okay. I hate that person. I hear the person has been severely injured in a car crash. I'm glad because I hate that person. I'm glad something bad has happened to that person. That is hatred. So let's listen again to God's response when Cain gets angry because his offering is less acceptable to God. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why are you dejected? If you act rightly, you will be accepted. But if not, sin lies in wait at the door. Its urge is for you, yet you can rule over it." So God gives him a chance to redeem himself. Yes, he feels angry, but if he acts rightly, he will be accepted. And of course, for him to act rightly would be to rejoice in the fact that his brother's Abel's offering has found favor with God. So if he acts rightly, yes, he feels angry, but if he acts rightly. So what counts for God is not so much our feelings as our actions. Because feelings come over us, okay? They come over. There are not choices. I do not choose to feel this. I do not choose to feel angry. It comes over me. I feel angry. Someone upsets me. Someone says something I don't like. I feel angry. What counts then is the action. How do I deal with that? What do I do? Okay, what do I do? If someone makes me angry, do I do something to hurt that person? Some action, whatever it is. So what counts for God are actions, because actions are in our control. Feelings come and go. So the choice before Cain is how to deal with his anger. That is what he had to do. He had to deal with his anger. Sin is waiting to tempt him, God says, but he can rule over it. So, of course, the temptation for Cain, go and kill your brother. That is the temptation. Okay, go and kill your brother. But he can rule over it. He didn't have to give in to that temptation. He didn't have to, but he did. So sin is waiting to tempt him, but he can rule over it. God will not force Cain to act rightly. So he's giving him the choice. If you want, you can act like this. He has given him the gift of free will. But he has also given him the capacity to act rightly. In other words, we have the capacity not to give in to a temptation. God has given us that capacity. We can't say no. Okay. Of course, that means also that we are responsible for our actions. Okay. Someone says, why did you do that? Because I was tempted to do it. Okay, but did you have to give in to the temptation? No, right? So I am responsible. Okay. I feel the temptation to rob a bank. Okay. But now if I do rob the bank and I'm caught, I will be put in jail because I am responsible for what I did. So I cannot say to the judge, oh, I felt a great temptation to rob the bank. In other words, the temptation is the cause. The judge will say, no, I'm sorry. That's not how it works. Okay, you could have said no to the temptation. Okay. So, this is what makes life so dramatic. When birds build their nests, they follow their instincts. But we human beings are called to choose our actions. We find ourselves caught between the desire to do good and the temptation to do evil. We find ourselves caught between this. Exactly what St. Paul says. He has the desire to do good, but he finds himself doing evil. So when Cain had killed his brother, he might have thought that the matter was ended, but not for God. God addresses him personally. Where is your brother, Abel? Okay. Where is your brother? So just like Adam, we see this terrifying reality of having to respond personally to God. We can imagine that Cain might have tried to cover up the murder of his brother, perhaps by burying his body or saying that he had been killed with a wild animal. Okay? And he went back to his parents. If they said, where is your brother? I don't know. Maybe he has been killed by a wild animal. Okay, he could have deceived or tried to deceive others, but not God. He cannot deceive God, although he foolishly tries to lie to God by saying he doesn't know where his brother is. That's what I don't know where. And he does know, of course, because he killed him. I don't know where. And almost reprimanding God. Am I my brother's keeper? As if to say, why are you bothering me? I am not responsible for my brother. Right? Okay. He's almost arguing, answering back to God. Am I my brother's keeper? I have to ask myself, do I also sometimes have that attitude? Am I my brother's keeper? So here we are at a core decision about human responsibility. Am I or am I not responsible for other human beings? Okay, am I or am I not responsible for other human beings? So in one sense, it would appear logical to say that since each person has free will to make their own decisions, whether for good or bad, then everyone must be only responsible for himself or herself. Okay? You make your decisions, I make my decisions. You are responsible for yours, I'm responsible for mine, and that's it. Okay? I don't have any obligation towards you. But the whole message that comes clearly to us in this episode is the opposite. Yes, I am responsible for my brother. I am responsible. I am my brother's keeper. And not just my blood brother, but for every human being. Because remember that these stories in the Bible, they represent humanity. Okay, they are representative. So that brother, am I my brother, refers to every brother and sister. This can even be taken to the extreme, where I take upon myself the responsibility for the sins of my brother. Okay? So even if my brother commits a sin, somehow I take responsibility. Somehow it's also my sin. Somehow it's also my sin. I take responsibility. Okay? Even if only to say, as Jesus did, forgive him for he knows not what he did. So I can make a case for. So if someone is being accused, I can say to the accuser, forgive him because he didn't know what he was doing. Okay, so I'm pleading on behalf of the one who has sinned because I feel some empathy for the sinner. I feel, as St. Augustine says, there but for the grace of God go I. Okay, So I take upon myself the responsibility for the sins of my brother. This is what Jesus did for us in front of the Father in heaven. Okay? It's as if he pleads on our behalf to the Father. Okay? He says, I will take responsibility for their sins. I will, unload all the sins of humanity onto me. Right? That's what Jesus does for us. And of course, whatever Jesus does for us, he asks us to do the same for others. Okay? Love one another as I have loved you. So the logic of the gospel is that of saying, when someone does something wrong, perhaps if I had been a better witness to the gospel, the other person would not have made that wrong decision. So in other words, I haven't been helpful to the other by showing him how a Christian should act. Okay, I haven't been a good example. Right? If I had been a better example, very often fathers say that after some sort of tragedy with their son. Perhaps their son becomes a drug addict or a thief or whatever. And the father examines his conscience and said, maybe if I had been a better example to my son, maybe he wouldn't have ended up like this. Some fathers say that, right? They have this sense that I wasn't so present for my son, didn't give him good example. Okay. So, however, Cain wants to live in a world where he is not responsible to his brother. That's the sort of world he wants. Okay? A world where I'm not responsible for my brother. I'm only responsible for myself. That's the sort of world. But that is not the world that God created. God didn't create a world where I am not responsible. He created a world where I am responsible. Okay? That's the way he decided to create the world. Okay? I'm going to create a world where human beings are responsible for each other. Right? That's the world he created. So we can see Cain is, we could say, in revolt against the order of creation. Okay? The order of creation is that we are responsible for each other. He's trying to, in revolt again. I don't want that kind of a creation. I want my own creation where I make the rules, and the rules are, first rule is no one is responsible for anyone else. That's the first rule in Cain's world. In the 19th century in Europe, there was an increasing presence of atheism, especially among intellectuals. So Dostoevsky, a Russian writer of that time, saw what the consequences of this would be. He said, if God is dead, then everything is permitted. If God is dead, everything is permitted. Because it is God who gives the order of creation. And in his order, I am not permitted to not be responsible for my brother. Instead, if God is dead, everything is permitted. The foundation of the moral order of the universe collapses if God is dead. And as we say, all hell breaks loose. Right? Literally, all hell breaks loose. In the logic of Cain, there is constant war. Okay, the logic of Cain. If that becomes part of the accepted way of acting, then there will be constant war. Everyone will be murdering everyone else. Right? It will be competition, rivalry. So it is no coincidence that the book of Genesis places the episode of the murder of Abel at the very beginning of the dawn of history. Okay? Right after the creation, we have this. It tells us that the first consequence of original sin is our capacity for murder. Okay? That is very chilling. Okay? Capacity for murder. We should not be shocked that this capacity is in each one of us. We should not be shocked. Okay. We may not physically murder anyone, but we can have so much hatred in our hearts against someone that we wish him or her to be dead. Okay. I may not go so far as doing the murder myself, but I can, in my heart, I can wish that person was dead. King David didn't physically murder Uriah, but he wished him dead, and he made it happen. Okay, he sent them to the battlefield right at the front, where he knew he would probably be killed, and that's happened. So, in all respects, we can say he did murder him. So, in making his offering to God, Cain making his offering to God, it might seem that Cain respected God as the creator of the universe, but his actions show how shallow this respect is. Yes, he's giving an offering, but inside there is waiting to be shown favor, looking for gratitude. So this is the type of hypocrisy that Jesus condemned in the Pharisees. They made an outward show of their obedience to the law, but their hearts were far from God. Far from God. So the prophets of Israel increasingly and unceasingly condemned those who made burnt offerings to God, but neglected to care for the widows, the orphans, the poor, the stranger. So one of the clearest revelations that we find in the Bible is the unbreakable bond between love of God and love of neighbor. Okay? God doesn't want our offerings if we are not taking care of our neighbor. Okay? Jesus goes as far as to say, whatever you did to the least of my brothers, you did it to me. So Jesus identifies himself with every human being. Whatever you do to him, you're doing it to me. Or whatever you fail to do, you do it to me. So we can say that Cain, in murdering his brother, was murdering Jesus. Because Jesus identifies himself with everyone. Okay? So, in one of his homilies, Pope Benedict pointed out the relationship between love of God and love of neighbor. So these are the words of Pope Benedict. Love of God and love of neighbor are inseparable and mutually related. Jesus did not invent one or the other, but revealed that they are essentially a single commandment, and did so not only through the word, but especially in his testimony. The person of Jesus and his whole mystery embody the unity of love of God and neighbor, like the two arms of the cross, vertical and horizontal. There is an inseparable bond. How can you say you love God whom you do not see, if you do not love your neighbor whom you can't see? Okay, that's an unbreakable bond. Okay. I can say I love God, and someone can say to me, well, show me how you love your neighbor, and then I'll believe that you say you love God. So we can ask ourselves, do I think I can love God without loving my neighbor? And don't be surprised if you and I answer yes. Of course, if I answer out of what theology tells me, right? No. Okay. I can't love God without loving my neighbor. But in my practice, I may be doing it. Okay. I may be saying my prayers. I may be going to Mass. I may be saying the Rosary. I may be reading Scripture, adoration, and failing to love my neighbor. It can happen. So, in the Vigil for Peace on 7th of September 2013, Pope Francis spoke about love of my neighbor. So these are Pope Francis's words. When man thinks only of himself, of his interests, and places himself in the center, when he permits himself to be captivated by idols of dominion and power, when he puts himself in God's place, then all relationships are broken and everything is ruined. Then the door opens to violence, indifference, and conflict. This is precisely what the passage in the book of Genesis seeks to teach us in the story of the fall. Man enters into conflict with himself. He realizes that he is naked, and he hides himself because he is afraid. He is afraid of God's glance. He accuses the woman. She who is flesh of his flesh. He breaks harmony with creation. he begins to raise his hand against his brother to kill him. Can we say that from harmony he passes to disharmony? No, there is no such thing as disharmony. There is either harmony or we fall into chaos, where there is violence, argument, conflict, fear. The Pope continues, it is exactly in this chaos that God asks man's conscience, where is Abel your brother? And Cain responds, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Pope says, we too are asked this question. It would be good for us to ask ourselves as well, am I really my brother's keeper? Pope says, yes, you are your brother's keeper. To be human means to care for one another. But when harmony is broken, a metamorphosis occurs, a change. The brother who is to be cared for and loved becomes an adversary to fight, to kill. What violence occurs at that moment? How many conflicts, how many wars have marked our history? We need only look at the suffering of so many brothers and sisters. This is not a question of coincidence, but the truth. We bring about the rebirth of Cain in every act of violence and in every war. All of us. And even today, we continue this history of conflict between brothers. Even today, we raise our hands against our brother. Even today, we let ourselves be guided by idols, by selfishness, by our own interests. And this attitude persists. We have perfected our weapons. Our conscience has fallen asleep. And we have sharpened our ideas to justify ourselves. As if it were normal, we continue to sow destruction, pain, death. Violence and war lead only to death. They speak of death. Violence and war are the language of death. These are the words of the Pope. So, if we want to look at another parable in the Gospel, which should be read alongside the episode of Cain, it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? This is the Gospel's answer to Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper? We know the story very well. Man has been beaten, robbed. He's there on the ground, wounded. A priest and a Levite pass by, ignoring him, but the Samaritan stops to take care of him. So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite pass by the wounded man without stopping. Perhaps both of them felt they were pleasing to God because they kept the law. Okay, remember, these are religious people, priest and Levite. Instead, it is the Samaritan who is pleasing to God. Okay. The parable of the Good Samaritan is the true answer to Cain's question. Am I my brother's keeper? Okay. The Good Samaritan is his brother's keeper. And he shows it, not with ideas, but with facts, concrete. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas says that before I even choose whether or not to help my neighbor, I am already responsible for my neighbor. In other words, it's not that I can come to a situation with my neighbor in a neutral fashion and say, let me decide whether or not I should help my neighbor, as if the choice is up to me. No. Even before I make that choice, I'm already responsible. Okay? Responsibility for others is part of my existence. It's part of who I am. That's who I am. I don't have the choice of whether or not I want to be responsible. I am responsible. So this is what the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas says, and he's Jewish. But he says, the other becomes my neighbor precisely through the way the face of the other summons me, calls for me, begs for me, and in so doing recalls my responsibility and calls me into question. Responsibility for the other, for the naked face of the first individual to come along. A responsibility that goes beyond what I may or may not have done to the other, or whatever acts I may or may not have committed, as if I were devoted to the other man before being devoted to myself. Okay? I am devoted to the other before being devoted to myself. It's a responsibility stemming from a time before my freedom. Before, but in what past? Not in the time preceding the present, in which I might have contracted any commitments. Responsibility for my neighbor dates from before my freedom in an immemorial past. In other words, that responsibility comes from way back. Okay? Sorry. I come into the world already being responsible. So here Levinas is arguing for an overturning of the anthropological vision of the human person, which is grounded in the pure freedom to act as I choose. That would be a vision of the human person. Okay? Human person is someone who is free to make choices, and that's it. Okay? I can choose this or I can choose this. This is who a human being is. Instead, no, that's not the sort of person a human being. Responsibility for every neighbor resides at a deeper level in my being than my freedom to act. So it's deeper. Okay? Yes, I have the freedom to act, but deeper is my responsibility to others. That's even deeper. Characterizes. This is what Levinas is saying. This is who the human person is. Okay? So, in his apostolic letter, Salvifici Doloris, Pope John Paul II comments on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, this is what Pope writes. The parable of the Good Samaritan belongs to the gospel of suffering, for it indicates what the relationship of each of us must be towards our suffering neighbor. We are not allowed to pass by on the other side indifferently. We must stop beside him. Everyone who stops beside the suffering of another person, whatever form it may take, is a good Samaritan. This stopping does not mean curiosity. Sometimes you see in a car crash, people stop and look because they're curious to see what happens. No, the Pope says, this stopping does not mean curiosity, but availability. It is like the opening of a certain interior disposition of the heart, which also has an emotional expression of its own. The name Good Samaritan fits every individual who is sensitive to the suffering of others, who is moved by the misfortune of another. So the Pope continues, if Christ, who knows the interior of man, emphasizes this compassion, this means that it is important for our whole attitude to others' suffering. Therefore, one must cultivate this sensitivity of heart, which bears witness to compassion toward a suffering person. So I can ask myself, do I have compassion towards a suffering person? Is my heart moved by the suffering of another, or am I cold and indifferent? Do I pass by like the priest or the Levite? Or am I like the Good Samaritan who felt compassion for this person who was suffering? Now the Pope says, therefore one must cultivate this sensitivity of heart, which bears witness to compassion towards a suffering person. Sometimes this compassion remains the only or principal expression of our love for and solidarity with the sufferer. Okay? Sometimes you may not be able to help the person. Okay? If you go to visit a person who's sick in hospital, it's not that you can start doing things, right? But you can feel compassion for the person. You can feel the suffering of the person. And the person you are visiting recognizes that. The person recognizes, yes, you are somehow moved by his or her suffering. Okay? And that is a consolation. When you are suffering, one of the greatest consolations is to find someone who empathizes with your suffering. Someone who's there ready to share your suffering. Okay? You're not abandoned in your suffering. Okay? That is one of the most difficult things when you are suffering, is when you feel you are abandoned in your suffering. No one cares for you. People pass by. Okay? It increases the suffering. Okay? Multiplies the suffering. So the Pope then continues, this is Pope John Paul II, nevertheless, the Good Samaritan of Christ's parable does not stop at sympathy and compassion alone. They become for him an incentive to actions aimed at bringing help to the injured man. In a word, then, a Good Samaritan is one who brings help in suffering, whatever its nature may be. Help which is, as far as possible, effective. He puts his whole heart into it. Nor does he spare material means. We can say that he gives himself his very eye, opening this eye to the other person. Okay, the whole of himself. Here we touch upon one of the key points of all Christian anthropology, the Pope says. Man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. A Good Samaritan is the person capable of exactly such a gift of self. Okay. That is Pope John Paul II. Okay. This is Christian anthropology. In other words, the Christian vision of who the human person is. We cannot find ourselves except through a sincere gift of ourselves to others. This is the way God made us, right? So if we act outside of that, we are acting against our nature. Okay, so the egoist, the selfish person, the one who thinks only of himself or self, they are, in some way we could say, anthropologically sick, in the sense that they are not in harmony with who they are. Okay? A sincere gift of self. And the Pope emphasizes that this has to be concrete. Okay? I'm a gift to the other concretely. So if the other is thirsty, I give a glass of water. If the other is hungry, I give something to eat. If the other is somehow in doubt, I give some advice. Someone needs help with their study, and I know. So it's concrete. Okay. So in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis comments on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So these are the words now of Pope Francis. And he's talking about the characters in the parable. Okay? There's the robber, there's the man suffering, there's the priest, the Levite, the Good Samaritan. He says, which of these persons do you identify with? The question, blunt as it is direct and incisive. Which of these characters do you resemble? We need to acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. Let us admit that. For all the progress we have made, we are still illiterate when it comes to accompanying, caring for, and supporting the most frail and vulnerable members of our developed societies. We have become accustomed to looking the other way, passing by, ignoring situations until they affect us directly. Says all the progress we have made huge progress scientifically, technologically, huge progress. And yet, we can still ignore the person suffering beside us. There are still people suffering from hunger, famine, lack of housing, wars, conflicts, refugee camps. For all the technology we have, we still have this vast amount of human suffering, which, okay, some of the rich countries send aid, okay, but that's not so difficult to do, okay? If, like Bill Gates, you have $50 billion and you give $20 billion aid, it's not so difficult. No, we won't condemn that, but it's not so difficult, right? It's more difficult to go to the place and stay beside the person who's suffering and hold the hand of the person who's suffering. Okay. So the Pope continues, the parable is clear and straightforward, yet it also evokes the interior struggle that each of us experiences as we gradually come to know ourselves through our relationships with our brothers and sisters. Sooner or later, we will all encounter a person who is suffering. Today, the Pope says, there are more and more of them. The decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. Okay, it's a political project, it's a social project, but how is it going to concretely affect those who are suffering? So that should be the criteria for judging. Pope says each day we have to decide whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. Whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. And he says, and if we extend our gaze to the history of our own lives and that of the entire world, all of us are or have been like each of the characters in the parable. All of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passers-by, and something of the Good Samaritan. Okay? We have all of us been, okay? The question is, which of those do I want to give prominence to? Okay? Which of those do I want to increase, allow to increase, and which do I want to decrease? Okay? So, the parable is telling us the one that I should really identify as the one I want to be is the Good Samaritan. Okay? That's what I'm aiming. The Pope continues, one detail about the passers-by does stand out. The passers-by, they were religious, devoted to the worship of God, a priest and a Levite. This detail should not be overlooked. It shows that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in a way pleasing to God. That's the question. Am I living in a way that's pleasing to God? A believer may be untrue to everything that his faith demands of him, and yet think he is close to God and better than others. The The guarantee of an authentic openness to God, on the other hand, is a way of practicing the faith that helps open our hearts to our brothers and sisters. St. John Chrysostom, that is one of the fathers of the church, expressed this pointedly when he challenged his Christian hearers. Do you wish to honor the body of the Saviour? Do not despise it when it is naked. Do not honor it in church with silk vestments, while outside it is naked and numb with cold. Yes, we have these wonderful ceremonies in church, etc., which are beautiful and which have their value. But what about that person outside who's cold and hungry? Pope continues, paradoxically, those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. Someone may not be particularly religious, but when they see someone who needs help, they go and help. The Pope continues, Jesus asks us to be present to those in need of help, regardless of whether or not they belong to our social group. In this case, the Samaritan became a neighbor to the wounded Judean. By approaching and making himself present, he crossed all cultural and historical barriers. We know that the Jews and the Samaritans were enemies. Jesus concludes the parable by saying, go and do likewise. So it's very clear that Jesus is using this parable to tell us how we should act towards our neighbor. Pope says, in other words, he challenges us to put aside all differences and in the face of suffering to draw near to others with no questions asked. I should no longer say that I have neighbors to help, but that I must myself be a neighbor to others. Okay. I must be a neighbor to others, to everyone. So it's not a matter of saying, this is my neighbor, I help, this one is not my neighbor. So I'm not categorizing on the basis of the person who needs to be helped. I am the one who said, I will be a neighbor to that person. The Pope says, human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. Nor can they fully know themselves apart from an encounter with other persons. I communicate effectively with myself only insofar as I communicate with others. No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. That is why the Pope is so concerned about this virtual reality. Okay? We encounter people only through virtual digital technology. He says no. Real love must have the actual physical person next to you, concretely. Not an image in a phone. Okay, that's okay for communication, but love requires the physical presence of the other person. So he continues, no one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. Life exists where there is bonding, communion, fraternity. And life is stronger than death when it is built on true relationships and bonds of fidelity. On the contrary, there is no life when we claim to be self-sufficient and live as islands. In these attitudes, death prevails. Now, concluding with the Pope's words, in the depths of every heart, Love creates bonds and expands existence, for it draws people out of themselves and towards others. Since we were made for love, in each one of us, a law of ecstasis, that is, going out of ourselves, seems to operate. The lover goes outside the self to find a fuller existence in another.